Hello and welcome to another episode of the DigiTeacher Digest. I'd like to try something a little bit different this week and look at a book. So the book is really big and it's going to take quite a few of these video sessions to get through. The book is Knowledge and Knowers by Carl Mayton. In this book, Mayton draws on the work of Basil Bernstein and Pierre Bourdieu and puts together a set of cognitive tools, conceptual tools, which are very useful when unpacking what's going on in educational and other spaces. I came across the book when researching for my master's dissertation in educational technology. Mayton works at the University of Sydney, and the framework is called Legitimation Code Theory, which is really about how knowledge is legitimated. How do we know what is legitimate knowledge in any particular field? And from the title of the book you can see that it's all about knowledge and knowers. There is always something to be known, and there is always someone doing the knowing. So knowledge and knowers are always present. There are a growing number of scholars across the world who use legitimation code theory as their lens for looking at things. A big community in South Africa, for example. I belong to one, the WITS LCT Hub, which is directed by Professor Lee Rosniak. And it's a very welcoming, inclusive community where we get together and discuss our ideas. Many of us are teachers, not just academics. And it's also very useful as a pedagogy. So in computer science, for example, semantic waving, which is part of the LCT framework and which I'll be discussing a bit later, is now an accepted part of the pedagogical approaches which are being taught to teachers. At WITS, it's an essential part of teacher training. If after this video you're interested in getting hold of the LCT Centre, and finding out more on what communities you can join, I'll put the links in the description to the centre itself, their website, and to the Facebook and Twitter handles. Carl's book, Knowledge and Knowers, is often considered somewhat dense, somewhat inaccessible, certainly quite a steep learning curve. But the ideas themselves are almost self-evident. When I first read it, it consisted almost entirely of aha moments. I was reading it and thinking, of course, yes, that makes perfect sense. And because it comes together as a kind of package, it puts together many aspects of the educational space, which is what I'm interested in, and it puts it all together in a way which makes coherent sense. The ideas themselves are actually very, very simple. So I'm going to try and put them across with apologies to where I miss out on more difficult theory and all the nuances and things. But try to put the ideas across as simply as possible in a series of videos. And I'd like to start in this video by looking at the first dimension of legitimation code theory, which is that of specialization. The whole question of what constitutes knowledge. So if we think of knowledge as lying along a spectrum, you can think of it in many fields, in many endeavors, in many situations. No particular knowledge is needed. You don't really need to know anything in particular. On the other hand, sometimes highly specialized knowledge is needed. Knowledge is far more important. What you know really, really counts, and that is the important thing which will lead to success or failure in any endeavor. And to give this a fancy name, we can call it epistemic relations. What's important is it works on a continuum from weaker, less important, to stronger, more important. So in the sciences, for example, knowledge is normally hierarchically structured. Concepts build one on the other, and the ultimate aim, obviously, would be to unify the fields, to be able to have a complete understanding of everything. In the humanities, on the other hand, knowledge is more horizontal. Knowledge in one area doesn't depend on knowledge in another area. Having any particular knowledge is far less important than it is in the sciences. So moving on from the epistemic relations, which is all about the knowledge itself, whether it's less or more important, to the social relations, which is all about the knower, the knowing, who you are as a knower. This can be relatively less important on one end of the spectrum. You don't have to be anyone special to know something, to it being far more important, either because of your position in society, what you are born into, or because you have acquired a particular gaze, a particular way of looking at the world, which gives you a privileged position which legitimates your knowledge. Thinking about it in this way allows us to draw up a matrix where we overlay our vision of what it is to have knowledge and what it is to be the right kind of knower. So you have stronger or weaker epistemic relations on the one hand, all about the knowledge, and stronger or weaker social relations on the other hand, all about the knower. And within this matrix you can plot in any particular field different ways in which knowledge in that field is legitimated. And these are called codes. These are the legitimation codes, if you like. So, for example, where you have a situation where the knowledge is foregrounded, in other words, where you have stronger epistemic relations, what you know is really, really important. But you have weaker social relations, where what kind of person you are is not so important. Then you have what's called a knowledge code. So the knowledge is what legitimates the practice in this case. On the other hand, where the social relations are stronger, in other words, what kind of knower you are is much more important, but you have weaker epistemic relations, the actual knowledge doesn't matter so much, then you have a knower code. And these are the two main codes that you find. There are others. So, for example, where you have stronger epistemic relations and stronger social relations at the same time, it's called an elite code. And where you have weaker epistemic and weaker social relations, what you know doesn't really matter and who you are doesn't really matter, then you have a relativist code. Now, I'm presenting all of this information purely for the sake of completion. I think the main ones that are necessary to think about when we're thinking about pedagogy and how to teach are the knowledge code and the knower code. What this perspective gives us, I think, is a tool, a way of looking at teaching, which allows us quite quickly to distinguish between different types of lessons. So let's take, for example, a science class. So I'm a science teacher and perhaps I'm teaching face-to-face or I'm teaching online. And science is mainly a knowledge code. So who you are doesn't really matter. A scientist can come from anywhere. You are legitimated as a scientist by acquiring a body of knowledge, basically. But that's not the whole story. Within the field of science, there are aspects of disposition, of ways of seeing the world that are also important. So there might be many aspects of a science curriculum which are also dedicated to teaching these dispositions, sets of behaviors, ways of looking at science, which could be identified more as a knower code. So I want to present a kind of hypothesis for this particular video, and that is that knowing whether what you're teaching falls mainly within a knowledge code or a knower code should help guide us in what tools, i.e. what pedagogies or what digital tools, technologies we decide to use in that particular lesson. So it seems to me obvious from all of this that when you are teaching any particular subject or any particular topic within the curriculum, you need to have a quite clear idea of what it is that you are teaching. Are you teaching in the knowledge code? Is your emphasis going to be on the concepts and how they fit together, on building knowledge structures? Or are you trying to build a knower? Is your emphasis on the dispositions, the behaviors, the ways of seeing, being, thinking, doing that constitute a knower? And once you've decided that, you can start to work on the pedagogies involved. So if you're working in the knowledge code, obviously you're working with concepts and how these concepts build one on the other. And you need to think about how you're presenting them to students so that they understand them, and what activities students must do to consolidate and work through these concepts. If you're working in the knower code, then you're thinking about how you're modeling ways of seeing, being, thinking, doing, and what interaction students need in order to acquire this gaze and practice it. So let's say that I'm looking at my computer coding curriculum and identify the particular knowledge that I want students to get out of it. In other words, the programming concepts largely. I'll decide on a sequence. I'm going to introduce this first, then that, etc. Then I might look at what activities I want students to do to be able to practice and get those concepts. But then I also need to think about the dispositions I want students to acquire. I think this poster from Barefoot Computing puts the issue very well. So on the one hand, you have the knowledge code, the concepts, the computational thinking concepts that you want students to acquire. On the other hand, you have the knower dispositions, the knower gazes, the approaches. You want them to become tinkerers, you want them to become creative, to be able to debug, to persevere, to collaborate. And how are you going to teach these particular dispositions? So you might say, well, okay, that's all very well, but you don't really need the theory. You don't need legitimation code theory to reach this conclusion. And indeed, in any one subject, teachers have been thinking about how to present concepts, how to present the knowledge, and how to present the kinds of dispositions, the kinds of knower codes that they want students to acquire. That's nothing new. But I think for people responsible, for example, for ICT integration within a school, helping different teachers right across the curriculum to use digital technologies in their teaching better, or for anyone who's trying to set up online learning and trying to help teachers find the right platforms and the right technologies to use for that, being able to think about subjects across the curriculum, whatever they may be, in terms of, well, is that teacher trying to teach a knowledge code or a knower code at any particular time, is extremely helpful. It gives us a way of looking at all subjects across the curriculum and being able to integrate and articulate with things like digital technologies in a much more thoughtful way. And I think the same is true of thinking skills. So a lot of schools are working on cognitive education programs, and I think the same applies. Is that teacher working within a knowledge code mainly or a knower code is a very important question as to what thinking skills, what approaches they use. So as a very quick kind of example, if you're looking at the knowledge code, then maybe you could design digital interactions or online interactions which use shorter videos which zone in on particular concepts, kind of Khan Academy style of presentation. You need to know about photosynthesis. Well, here's something you can use to revise that concept if you need to. You're probably going to be wanting to do group or class activities working through these concepts, so students get a chance to practice the concepts, practice working with them, the teacher's able to break something down, explain it to a class, and have students ask questions about it. And of course in science, for example, you've got the wonderful simulation platforms where you can simulate an electric circuit and stuff like that. So allowing students to be able to manipulate the concepts and play with them. On the other hand, when you're working within a knower code, you might want to be thinking about establishing more interactive sessions. For example, small group seminars, which are very typical of tertiary English education, for example, English literature, where students are able to meet and grapple with the text and have the teacher model how they approach reading a text. You might want to be able to set up fishbowl type exercises where you can watch people doing something and be able to comment on how they went about it, because it's all about the approach. Online breakout rooms might help here. And maybe projects with feedback sessions, when you examine student work and talk about it. So Noah code approaches, I think, would largely differ from knowledge code. Obviously there are overlaps, but I think using knowledge and Noah codes is a very good way of helping us to think about how to map particular technologies to the content that's being taught. You need to understand what content is being taught. Is it in the knowledge code? Is it in the Noah code? And to help inform your mapping process, which technologies are you going to bring in? Which technologies are you going to use? Which pedagogies? Because pedagogy is a technology, of course. So to my mind, it's been a very helpful framework simply for thinking about questions around ICT integration. So when a teacher comes to me, and this happened at the beginning of lockdown, for example, and said, what must I use? How am I going to go online and teach? You know, one of the first things I thought of was, well, what subject are they teaching? And what kinds of interactions am I expecting that teacher to have with the student? And that's largely dependent on which code they are majorly in before, turning to, well, I suggest this platform or that platform. So I think LCT provides us, the whole idea of knowledge and knowers provides us with a very useful framework, a very useful way of thinking about pedagogy across the whole school. It's quite different, I think, when you're an individual teacher in a classroom. You think more in terms of the curriculum that you have to cover, and you think about how you've covered it in the past, and what's worked or what hasn't worked, and you're trying some new things out. But when you're kind of standing from an ICT integration point of view, or trying to plan online learning, then you're trying to look across the whole school to find out what platforms are useful and which aren't. And I hope you found this video useful. I will in future videos look at other aspects of legitimation code theory and how they help, particularly in the computing classroom and ICT integration, online learning, that kind of space. If you enjoyed this channel, please like, please subscribe, please share, and hit the notification bell to make sure that you never miss an episode again.